So I'm at Festival of Marketing with Charlie Ashe of V Interactive. Charlie, in light of your session, the power of the data management platform, you talked about how volume of data has now led to an addiction, in a way, in the advertising industry. Can you just expand on that and whether that's a good thing?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we have an addiction in terms of data, but what we're not necessarily asking is actually how are we going to turn that data into something meaningful. I think there's a slight case at the moment that all data is good data, and if you talk to any data scientist, I think they will tend to say that that's not actually necessarily the case. So what we need to try and start to, I think and understand is what are we trying to achieve from the data that we have, and then we need to reflect that back on where we're looking for data and where we're trying to source data from. Because we've been so greedy, I think, in terms of data, and because we've been asking for it so much, we might run into a situation now where, especially with the GDPR, so the new EU regulations, we might have to start to actually pull back and start to filter a little bit more where we're getting data from and what data we're able to collect.
Okay. So where is all this data coming from?
So, I mean, it comes from a huge different amount of sources. Like, I mean, advertiser data and publisher data really are where most of the data is coming in terms of the on-site data. But every time that we have an interaction with a user, every time that we, touch a user, which sounds slightly dodgy, but every time that we give an impression or we serve a video, we need to be starting to try and track that data. And I think that's where we haven't been sort of particularly accurate. So we've been very good at collecting data to try and advise our targeting, but we haven't necessarily been taking data from the targeting that we've done. So the attribution and the ability to take all this data and understand whether we're actually doing targeting well is probably where we have much more room for advancement.
And so for the uninitiated, how would you summarize a data management platform in about 50 words or less?
So there was a beautiful quote from our chief data officer when we originally went to him, and we said we're looking to try and work out what data management platform we should be using. And we described the data management platform to him, and I can describe it very, very briefly, and he just said it's a large pivot table. And I think essentially there is a bit more to it than that. But essentially what you're talking about is taking data in from lots of different sources, modeling the data, so having some tools to make some changes to it, and trying to get something meaningful from the end result.
Okay. So with that in mind, once you've got that data, how do you go about making it something usable?
So what you need to look at is what are you trying to achieve. I think ultimately, for most of this data, or a lot of this data, what we're trying to do is audience targeting. So we're trying to find the right user. We're trying to find someone that is in the market for a holiday at this very moment. That's very hard to qualify. But what we can start to do is we can start to look for trends, and we can start to look for pieces of information. So it's not just a case of taking data and targeting people on a cookie basis. It's actually trying to work out, okay, well, if I know that these 1,000 people have already bought a product or bought my product, what do they have in common?
Okay, so just finally, we're obviously a performance marketing publisher.
Yeah.
That's our specialism. What would be your biggest takeaway in that regard?
Within performance marketing? So if you qualify the right user, then that is half the battle done. But how you then talk to that user is really, really vital. And what we need to start to try and understand is that while we're stuck on last click, and I'm sorry, we're going to go on to the attribution story, which everyone tends to, while we're stuck on last click, we're maybe not looking at the full user journey and understanding that, yes, we reached that user, but potentially they were already at the point where they were going to go and convert. So we need to start to track a little bit more, take a bit more data, and maybe look at the data before we apply a model to it.
And one more, what would you say are your biggest trends that you've noticed throughout the last 2 days, even on the conference agenda or in conversations you've had, just in terms of overall takeaways from Festival of Marketing?
So I think brands are interested in programmatic, and I think that's really, really exciting from our point of view. But what we now need to understand is that there is an education point that needs to happen there. Programmatic previously has been all about performance, and I think, increasingly what we're going to have to start to do is, from my point of view, is to talk to brands and make sure that they understand how data is being used and that they're happy with that data usage as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Charlie.